Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the vehicle. Once you have your wheels off the ground in the rear, we're going to go ahead and remove all 6 of these lug nuts. Remove your wheel. Just a quick heads up, even though you're doing a brake backing plate, you're still going to need a couple things. You're going to have to remove your rear differential cover, so of course you're going to need gear oil, which is going to be filling up that rear differential. You're also going to need some sort of seal, whether it's RTV or even the specific gasket made for this vehicle. One other thing that I would highly recommend that you don't necessarily need to do, we'll call it your prerogative, would be replacing the axle seal. Because to do this job, once we get the brakes apart and take the rear differential pan cover off and everything, we're going to have to remove this axle. Every time you remove the axle, you potentially damage that seal. One of the next things that we need to do is take a nice small pry bar like this. We're going to come in between the caliper and the pad, and we're just going to apply a little bit of leverage. What we want to do is just push in that caliper piston just a teeny bit to take the pressure off of the brakes. The next thing we need to do is remove our 2 18mm mounting bolts for our caliper. Just take a wrench. You can use a socket with a ratchet if you'd like. There's one bolt. I'm just going to start that in just a couple threads to hold the caliper for me while I remove the second. There it is. Let's get that other one out of there. Next we're going to take the caliper and we'll just set it up here where it's going to be nice and safe. Just make sure you put it somewhere that it's not going to potentially fall down and hopefully not hurt you in any way. Now it's going to be time to remove your rotor. You might need to give it a couple light bonks. The next thing we're going to do is use our 8mm and we're going to remove this small bolt right here. Just be careful because very often it's frozen in there and it might break off. Nice long ratchet did the trick. That little bolt out of there. Grab this out of here. Set those aside. I'm just going to grab onto this. You'll notice it can move around now. If you were to look under here, you're going to see the adjuster. If you just take that shoe, move it kind of closer to the axle, and then give it a loving bonk down, it should come free from the adjuster. Go ahead and grab that shoe. At this point, you can try to weasel it off the axle. There we are. The next thing we're going to have to do is take out this area right here. This is going to be the adjuster, and it should separate. We'll just spray it down with some penetrant. That looks good. Grab my little pry bar here. We need to separate the cogged area from the base area. Okay, starting to come up. Get this side out of there too. Next thing we're going to want to do is come behind here with a pry bar of some sort. Just grab on like this, and you should be able to draw this right out. For the next step, you're going to need a tool that looks a lot like this. You can use some long nose pliers if you don't have something like this, but this is potentially what would be best. Go ahead and grab onto the spring area of the e-brake cable. Go ahead and give it a tug. If you were to look behind here, you're going to see a nice plastic piece that's actually all of this right here, comes through the metal bracket. It's going to have a couple little ears on it. We need to press in those ears and then draw the whole cable out of this bracket. Like that. Okay, it's starting to move. I'm just going to use a little bit of penetrant because why not? There we are. Once you have the cable coming through, just go ahead and slide it past the bracket. There we go. The next thing we're going to want to do is make sure that the vehicle is in neutral. You want to be able to spin your drive shaft. With that said, come right over here to your fill plug on your rear differential. You're going to remove that next using a 3/8 ratchet. All right, let's grab a collection bucket for the next step. The next thing we're going to do is come right here for your e-brake cable. Just get that right out of its securing bracket. Okay. After that, go ahead and grab something and just kind of come along the side of your differential, approximately where the pan is. You just want to try to get out as much of that crud as possible so nothing will fall down inside of the differential once we get this cover off. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is make sure that we keep in mind that this is where the bracket's going to go, right in the center, because it needs to go back there once we take this all apart. Use your 13mm socket and a nice light hammer. You can use a rubber mallet if you're worried about it. Just go over these bolts and tap it on there. All we're trying to do right now is just kind of break free all the rust, rot, or any type of obstacle that's going to make it an issue to get these bolts out. We also want to make sure you have a nice collection bucket, because after you remove these bolts, there's going to be fluid behind here that needs to go somewhere, and it needs to be recycled. Now let's just start that bolt back in a little bit here. Now we're going to continue by removing all the rest of the bolts. Remove the pan. If for some reason your pan is stuck on the rear differential, you could use something as simple as a nice rubber mallet, give it a couple light bonks, or even try to get in between the pan and the differential itself with something as simple as a screwdriver or pry bar. Now if you were to look at the inside of this pan, you're going to see a whole bunch of debris, especially in this area right here where the magnet is. This is all small metal shavings, and it's no good for the inside of your differential. Speaking of no good, if you were to look all along the side where the gasket's supposed to ride between the pan and the differential, you're going to see a lot of debris. You need to make sure you clean all that up. So go ahead and clean it up. Clean up all this area. Make sure you get off all the debris. If you have a nice parts washer, that'll work great. Or of course you can use some parts cleaner. Just make sure you're using safety protection and do it over a recycling unit. The next thing we need to do is cover this whole area with something, because when we peel this up, we don't want very much dirt or debris getting inside this area, obviously. Just do whatever you can to try to protect it. That looks pretty decent. It's going to keep the majority of everything out. The next thing we need to do is clean up the surface on the rear differential where the gasket / pan is going to be. Now to clean this up, there's a couple things that you could use. You could use a nice scraper that looks like this. You could also use a razor blade if you were so inclined, because maybe you don't have a scraper. Something that I do recommend that you do not use would be something that looks like this. The reason for that is because, of course, it's coarse. It's going to, of course, tear into the metal of the rear differential, and all that metal dust that you're going to be shooting all around inside the air can accumulate on anything that's moist, which, well, everything is moist in there. And that can, of course, potentially cause damage with your bearings and other stuff inside the differential. So now let's go ahead and get this out of here. What you're going to notice is that the areas that had a lot of rust and everything are still going to be discolored. And that's okay. We're not necessarily worried about coloration. We're more or less worried about making sure everything is nice and smooth, so we have a great mounting surface or mating surface for when the gasket and the pan go on the differential. Don't worry so much about the dripping. We'll deal with that later. But to continue, the next thing we're going to do is grab onto that rear drive shaft, and we're going to spin it. And we're going to pay attention right inside of here, because we're looking for this pin, and we're also looking for this bolt right there. Now when we go to take out this bolt, it's going to be a long bolt, and it's going to come right straight through this pin and then in through a little bit further. Once you take out the bolt, there's a potential and a probability that this bolt or this pin right here is just going to want to slide out. That's hardened steel. If it slips and hits the ground, especially if you're on pavement, you could chip it or damage it in some way. So take out the bolt carefully, grab your pin, and slide it out. Now to remove this bolt, you can use a socket with a ratchet if you want to, but you're probably not going to have very much space. I prefer to go with an 8mm wrench, and if you have a 6-point, it's going to do good. Go ahead and put it right on there. Use a nice rubber mallet. We're just going to break that free. Work it back and forth, because there should be a teeny bit of Loctite on there, or thread locker. Now we're just going to remove that bolt. So that bolt's nice and loose, it can move around. Like I said, it's going to come straight through this pin. Make sure you hold up that pin, remove your bolt, and then slowly let this pin down and set it aside. Now if you spin that drive shaft around, you're going to see an area that looks like this. You don't want to mess with any of this stuff. We're not going to mess with that. I just go ahead and use my finger inside this hole. Be careful, because if you don't, what you might notice is that the gears on the inside are going to kind of get spun. So I'm just kind of keeping my finger in there. Be careful for any pinch points. Nobody should get hurt doing this. I'm going to try to spin this all the way around. So this hole right here is facing down. The reason why I want that is because inside here, the axle is going to come through the whole differential tube, and it's going to come out into here. And you can see where these little gears are right there. There's going to be a little clip. So what's going to happen next is I'm going to go over to the outer portion of the differential on the axle that I'm working on. I'm going to press it in. The little U-clip, it's going to look something like this, is going to go boop, fall out, and then fall inside here hopefully, or even inside my collection bucket. Give it a nice little wiggle around. We want to see if we can get that clip to fall out of there. If you can't, we're going to try using a pick or a magnet. I have a small pocket screwdriver that has a tiny magnet on it. You don't necessarily need the screwdriver portion, but you do need the small magnet. I'm going to come right in here along where that gear is, and I'm going to try to find right where that clip's going to be, the one that I told you about. It looks like a little U. I'm going to just stick it on there, and now I'm going to go back over to the outer portion of the axle and just try to move it around and see if we can get this clip to break free / come out. There it is, friends. Now for the next step, we want to have it back at a working height so we can easily get to our axle. Keep in mind that axles aren't super light, so it will be heavy. Also, something that you need to keep in mind is as we draw this away, there's going to be fluid that's inside this differential tube, and some of it's going to want to come out. So also, make sure you have a collection bucket underneath this axle portion here. I like to just wipe it as I pull it out. Awesome. Next, we're going to remove this bolt right here, and that's going to relieve this bracket. Just be careful not to put a tug on your brake line, or of course, pull down your caliper and potentially hurt yourself. Awesome. The next thing we want to do is take a nice rag and just try to cover up this hole. We don't want any debris getting in there. Using an 18mm socket, remove these 4 mounting bolts. Give this a wiggle. More than likely it's not going to break free. If that's the case, I would just use one of the bolts, start it in there just a few threads. The reason for that is because we're going to be using our hammer and carefully bonking on the back side trying to drive this away. The bolt is to protect you. That's great. We'll get the bolt off of here. Remove our backing plate there, and then we have what's left. So what you see here is pretty much what's left of the backing plate. Obviously, you don't want to leave any of this on there. You could probably grab the majority of it just by hand. Obviously, be very careful not to get a cut or anything like that. If it seems as though it's stuck on there for any reason, go ahead and use a nice small hammer. And if for some reason that isn't working, of course, you could try to get it behind it with something like that and just try to pry it away. Once you get it away, just take a look at the area. Anywhere that you see that looks like it's shiny and it goes around the larger round area right there, needs to be cleaned up. Okay, this is right where that backing plate's going to ride, so it needs to be nice and clean. Now let's go ahead and grab that bracket. Take a look at it. You can see areas that has a lot of buildup and crud that might potentially cause an issue, especially if you look from the backside. This is the area that you need to pay the most attention to. Right in this corner right there, you can see that it kind of comes up a lot from this area right there. So this is going to be a mating surface. Right here, right there. Make sure it's cleaned up and get off any of these large flakes that you can. Now if you were to look inside this area right here, you might see a whole bunch of crud. I would probably clean that out. So I'll use a little board brush on mine. We'll take a peek. Looks pretty decent. If you spin it around, you can look inside there. If you can still see crud, go ahead and hit it with some parts cleaner down into that collection bucket. Moving along, the next thing we need to take a peek at is our bolts. If you see any old existing thread locker, I would go ahead and make sure I got that off because we're going to be using new thread locker. The next thing we're going to need to do is take a little bit of grease. You can use caliper grease, you can use wheel bearing grease, you can use pretty much anything that's going to help keep moisture away. Just go right in between here because that's where that emergency brake lever is going to be. And I also like to go right around this outer edge because that's where our little boot's going to be, and I'll show you that right now. We have this little rubber boot. You're just going to take it, press it right on here like this. At this point, I'll grab my backing plate. Just like that. I'll work this at an angle, and then you'll see that the backing plate is going to be holding that rubber boot directly against that plate. Now just take this whole unit. I'm going to turn it just like this in this angle so you can see there's a gap right here for where the caliper is going to sit. This area right here is lined up to where the emergency brake cable is going to come down. Now we'll just grab our bolts and we'll start them in. Now we're going to take our 18mm and just snug these up. Let's go ahead and torque down these bolts to 100 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get this bracket back on here. Now the next thing I like to do is get this out of here. Time to install the axle. If you were to take a peek right down along this area, you're going to see the area where the bearing / seal is going to ride. Clean that down completely and inspect it. If you can see any wear or grooves, especially where the seal is supposed to ride, which would be pretty close to right there, you know you have an issue. Just carefully go over along the top of that seal. Be careful not to drag the axle along it very much though, because you could potentially ruin it. Go right in here. At this point, I can feel that it's stopped. Is it all the way in? Well, you can tell that it isn't. The reason why it's stopped is because down at the other end, there's the gears with the little notches that are going to have to line up with the splines on the axle. At this point, you can just kind of grab this and wiggle it around. If you push down over here, it's going to lift up on the pumpkin side, and hopefully you'll be able to align it. Okay, that just slid right in perfectly. Let's move along. Now our next step is kind of going to be a twofer. What we need to do is we need to get this clip back up and around that axle, and then once we do, we need to keep it there and grab the outer portion of the axle and draw it back away so it holds in this clip. Just slide this right up in there. I'm going to grab the axle, carefully slide it, watch for any pinch points. Okay, so now you want to take a peek up inside there. You want to make sure that that horseshoe, or the clip that is shaped like a horseshoe, is all the way up inside, and you want to barely be able to see it. If you can see a whole bunch of it, more than likely it's not completely in. Now let's step away from the pumpkin for a second and get right over to the axle. The reason why I wanted to do that is because I want us to grab onto it and give it a nice tug. You need to make sure that this axle is not able to pull out of your differential. If it can, at this point, you need to stop, get back over there, and fix that clip. Next thing we need to do, we need to be super careful for, because we're going to be taking our finger, putting it back inside this hole right here, and being super careful for any pinch points, because we're going to need to spin that differential, bring this back around so we can get the pin up through, and of course the mounting screw back in. There we go. Okay, so I can see where the pin's going to have to come through. I can see where the bolt's going to go through. I have plenty of clearance to be able to swing my wrench. Put your finger in there and just make sure that the hole lines up. If it doesn't, you can go ahead and just try to line it up just simply by spinning it a little bit, and then that should be perfect. Now, talking about reinstalling the screw, you want to make sure you pay special attention to the threads. If you see any thread locker on there, or if it looks as though the pin's damaged in any way, it's probably a great idea to either clean it up or replace it if need be. Now, I used a little bit of blue thread locker on this. I would definitely not recommend using no thread locker, and I would also definitely not recommend using red thread locker. Red thread locker is going to be super hard to get this out someday. With that said, we'll set it aside for 1 second, and although I don't recommend using parts cleaner inside of your differential because of the clutch gears and everything, I do actually recommend using it only inside of this little hole where the threads for the screw is going to be. So I'm just going to grab my rag, I'm going to direct it in specifically with my hose, and only use what needs be to clean out any of the gear oil that might be inside there. Make sure you clean that up as well. Great. Inspect it real quick for any imperfections, such as a crack going down it or any sort of damage that looks apparent. This looks good. Next, what I'm going to do is continue on by installing this. I want to make sure that the hole on the pin is facing down where the hole for the screw is going to go through. If it doesn't seem like it wants to go through, you just need to align the gears on the inside. Keep working at it. Should want to go. Don't go too far because then you have to, of course, get in there and push it back down. Keep your finger over this so it can't fall down. Grab that bolt with the thread locker on it. Go ahead and put it right on through there. Now we're going to snug this up. Just to say, it's always a great idea to go ahead and replace this pinion shaft locking bolt. Either way, whether you're replacing it or not, for torquing it, the 8.6-inch axle or rear differential, you want to torque that bolt to 27 foot-pounds. For the larger rear differential or axle, the 9.5-inch, you're going to want to torque that to 37 foot-pounds. So now it's time to take a look at our differential pan cover. This looks great. We cleaned it up. I did both sides. I made sure that there's nothing on the magnet, or at least as little as possible, especially in terms of large chunks of metal. This looks good. Let's take some gasket maker, or unless you of course bought a specific gasket that goes to this, if you have a specific gasket that's made of cork or paper or anything like that, do not use any gasket maker with it. Assuming you're not using one of those specific gaskets, go with this RTV. I'm just going to go right along, go around the hole. This is going to make a nice watertight seal. Make sure you don't have any debris or anything like that on any of these gears. And then just take a nice clean rag with maybe some solvent on it and just clean up any of this gear oil that might be on here because this is going to affect the gasket. We've got our plate or rear diff cover. We've got a lot of silicone on there. That looks great, or RTV. We're just going to put it so the bump or the bump out area is facing towards where the pinion gear is. Go ahead and line it up there. We'll take our bolts. You do not need to use any thread locker on these. Start them all in. Now it's going to be time to snug all these up. Do it in a crisscross manner. Now we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 30 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and grab this cable. Get it right into that bracket. Make sure that it's secured. It cannot flap around. If you used RTV, you're going to need to let it set and even dry, because if you use gear oil inside of it right now, it's going to potentially mess up the effect of the sealing agent of this RTV, and you might end up having leaks. If, of course, you did use an original gasket or a paper gasket or cork or whatever you might have used, and it was not a chemical such as RTV, you can, of course, go ahead and fill it now. Now we're just going to clean up this area right here. This is the pivot for the emergency brake. Get off any crud or debris that might be on there. Just use a little bit of this caliper grease. Go right along the area right there on that shaft. That's great. And this is just to act as a lubricant so we can push it through that boot. Be careful not to tear your boot in any way. Find the hole there. Slides right in. Perfect. The next thing we're going to need to do is secure our emergency brake cable inside of the bracket. This part's going to be a little bit hard, and I definitely don't want you to get hurt. So be careful when you do this. We're going to grab the cable with one hand, and we're going to be pulling rearward. We're going to grab our tool, and we're going to pull the spring forward. Separate the two, bring just the cable through the slot in the bracket, and then secure your cable. Right inside this area is where the adjustment's supposed to be for the emergency brake shoe. If you take it apart, and you happen to notice that this part right here is frozen, the part that has a little cog, this part right here should spin in there. If it does not, you need to completely separate these, clean them up, re-lubricate them, and then of course put them back together. This piece right here has like a little bobble. Believe it or not, that's not one piece. It actually does come apart, so you want to be careful not to lose this. It's a great idea to clean all this up as well. That's just about good right there. This flows smoothly. It's looking great. You want to make sure that this area right here is nice and clean, free of debris or anything that might obstruct it from being able to spin, because that's going to go inside this hole right here. How can I tell that this goes inside of this hole and not in the bottom hole? Because of this little clip right here. That clip is going to line up with the notches on this, and it's going to prevent it from spinning on its own. We're not going to put that in yet though. What we're going to do, grab some more of that caliper grease, and we're going to put it right inside the hole on the other piece. All right, this is going to be the other end. Just try to fill it right in there if you want. Get some more. More the merrier. Put it right in. Now I'm going to grab my nice clean pen. I inspected it. It's in good condition. I'll just put it right in there. Now we need to put a nice coating of that grease all along the areas where it's going to rub up along the unit right there. Now that those are nice and coated, let's continue on with the grease a little bit more, and we're going to go directly to where the adjuster is going to be. You can go ahead and put in as much grease as you want. If you put in too much, it's not really that big of a deal, but what you will notice is it will kind of come out. And if that was to happen, you would just kind of clean it up so you don't get any mess on your emergency brake shoe. Now we're going to take our pieces. Should slide right in there. Make sure it spins like it should. Do the same to the other side. Now before we go any further with doing the backing plate, you want to make sure that you look at this tab right here. You can see how that it's standing up. It's standing up quite a bit too. If you did not peen this over, it's going to more than likely hit against your rotor and you're going to have a loud scraping noise. You'll have to take your rotor back off, see where it's scraping. You look all along the usual areas and you'll probably never find the reason. Put it back on, scrape, scrape, scrape. Start losing your mind. The reason why is because of these tabs. The tabs need to be bent down. You can usually do it by hand or with a punch and a hammer. Peen it down like that. Do the same to the other side. You're going to need a little bit more of that caliper grease or whatever type of grease you're using, and you're going to put it on the contact points of this bracket where the emergency brake shoe is going to ride. The reason for that is, of course, for vibration dampening and noise reduction. So we'll come right down here because we know it's going to ride right along the outside there, right here. This is a spot right there. If you were to come up here, you're going to have this whole area. It hits up against there. And then if you come along the other side, you can clearly see exactly where the emergency brake shoe was riding before. Here we go. Now it's time to get the emergency brake shoe back up on here. To do this, you're going to have to do a little bit of contortioning and just a little bit of wiggling, and I'm sure over a period of time you should be able to figure out how to get it right over there. There we are. Nice light bonk, no big deal. We'll go ahead and line these tabs up with where it's supposed to sit on the adjuster there. Should slide over. If it doesn't, you can just kind of go past. Line up the adjuster ends so they're straight up and down, so they'll line up with the way that the shoe needs to go on. Once you've gone past, like I said right here, you should be able to just kind of stretch it and draw it straight up on there. That looks great. Now it's going to be time to get the mounting bracket on there. And it's a kind of funny looking thing. But if you were to look at it, you would see that it has an indented area right here. That's going to ride right on this bracket right there. You want it to be kind of facing in this general direction so that the black part is going to be riding up against the inner portion or the inner ridge of this shoe. Put it up on there, line up your screw hole, and then put in your screw. All right, so that's pretty much bottomed out right there. At that point, you definitely don't want to go too much further because it is just a very small bolt. But something that I would like to mention is you also don't want to go tight enough. With that said, once it's bottomed out, just give it a teeny bit more. Make sure it doesn't feel as though it's super loose to you. Give this a nice little wiggle. Make sure you don't see any movement between this and the bracket itself. I think that that looks great. The next thing that we need to do is clean up the mating surface where the rotor is going to match up against the axle. If it's all bumped up like this or rough in any way, just go ahead and sand it down with something. Now that the majority of the area is nice and clean and sanded down, we need to continue on by getting in between the lug studs and the rest of the hub area here, right in there. If you notice there's large buildup, you can use something like this, maybe a scraper or even a flathead screwdriver. Just kind of get the majority of it up, and then you can take a nice brush, just work at the rest. Now we're going to spray down the mating areas with some copper never sees. Before you go ahead and put your rotor back on there, look at the backside. This is the area that's going to meet up against the axle. You need to make sure that's nice and clean as well. Now that we've cleaned up the backside of the rotor, we're just going to place it over the axle like this. Push it all the way in, and it should go over the emergency brake shoes. If it doesn't go over the emergency brake shoes, de-adjust your adjuster. If it does go over, but you feel as though there's no drag at all, you're probably going to want to adjust it up a little bit. What you're actually going to want to do right now is get it so it's semi-close, so you can hear the shoes just barely dragging in there. Okay, that's the sound of the shoes hitting up against the inside drum portion of this rotor. If it's too tight and you try to turn it and it just doesn't want to turn, then you know that it's over adjusted. If your brakes are over-adjusted, they're going to overheat and you're going to have major braking issues. Now it's going to be time to get the caliper back on the vehicle. Before you go ahead and do that, you need to make sure that you clean all the existing thread locker off of these bolts. And I always like to replace it with some new thread locker of my own. Caliper around here. Make sure that your pads are situated inside the brackets as they need to be. They might keep wanting to fall out if they're like mine. Go ahead and grab those caliper mounting bolts. Start them both in. Now we'll snug them up and we'll torque them to 148 foot-pounds. We got our torque wrench. The next thing I always like to do at this point is to make sure I pump up the brake. Now it's going to be time to fill your rear differential. You need to make sure you go with the manufacturer specified fluid. For this particular application, the manufacturer recommends full synthetic 75/90 with limited slip additive. If you look right here, you're going to see 75W90, right? If you saw something that went along the next couple letters would say LS, that would stand for limited slip. This one doesn't have an LS. So you need to go out and get yourself an additive that says limited slip, supplement, or additive. Once you put in your additive completely, you're going to continue topping it off until it comes up just below this fill plug right here. So you can go ahead and put your finger in, take a peek, and if it seems like your finger's getting really wet, then more than likely you're at the level you need to be. Okay, so at this point, I've just put in my limited slip additive, and I've put in one full bottle and a little bit under another full bottle. It just barely started trickling out the top, so I stopped there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait for this to continue trickling out as much as possible. Optimally, at the level that you want your fluid to be at when your differential is sitting on a nice level surface, such as the ground, would be just about 1/8 of an inch below that fill hole. Doing that on the lift is a little bit different, of course, because the suspension is hanging, and if you're doing it on jacks or jack stands in the yard, depending on if you have the jack stands under the differential tube, that could work. But if you have it underneath the frame to try to lift the vehicle, it's going to be kind of slanted like ours is here. With that said, if you can get your level approximately 1/8 of an inch down below this fill hole, that's exactly where you want it. Next, it's going to be time to put our rear differential plug back in there. Just take a quick look at it, make sure it's in good condition. If you look at the threads and it looks like they're rotted, or maybe they're not going to make a good connection on the differential, you probably want to replace it. If you have any type of sealant around here, you probably want to get it off of there. If it looks as though the inside of this area is getting stripped out and it's not in very good condition, and you don't think that you'll be able to either tighten it up or even remove it further on down the line, it's probably a great idea to just go ahead and replace that plug. This one looks decent, so I'm just going to wipe it down and put it in there. Now we'll just snug it up until it bottoms out. That's it right there. Clean up your mess. Now it's going to be time to get the wheel up on here. Let's start on those lug nuts, and then we'll bottom them out and we'll torque them to 140 foot-pounds. Let's torque them. Double check them if you want, and if you have a center cover, put that on as well. Let's make sure we double check that brake fluid, give it a wiggle. It looks as though this is low. There's the maximum line. Open this up. We're going to add some .3 brake fluid. Bring it right up to that maximum line. Make sure you close it back up. Down the road you go.